Okay, so today we're going to work on our next set of seam samples. We are going to do a convex curve, a concave curve, a flat felled seam, as well as a turn and stitch seam. So learning a couple of different techniques and finishes today. I'm going to go ahead and start off with the flat felled seam. So I have two pieces of 8" by 4" blocked muslin that I'm going to use for my seam sample. And I'm going to go ahead and stitch this down at a 1/2 inch. And so a 1/2 inch would be my total seam allowance. So I have stitched and backstitched at the beginning and end of my seam. So now what I should do is press this open so that my seam allowance is completely flat on that stitch line. I'm going to finger press it just for demo purposes. So my seam is completely open. Now I'm going to trim down one side to about 1/8 inch so I can fold the other pieces out of my way. So I'm going to open it back up. So one side is trimmed down to 1/8 inch. The other seam allowance is still at a 1/2 inch. Now I'm going to, again with the iron, press it so that my seam allowance, the clipped side, is going towards the longer seam allowance. I'm going to fold the seam allowance and press it so that the edge of it is touching that 1/8 inch trimmed edge. This takes a lot of finessing to really get it straight. So once that is pressed, I'm going to flip it over so that you see the original line of stitching. And I'm going to go ahead and top stitch on that folded edge as close to the edge as possible because I really want to trap it down and secure it. And I'm stitching and back stitching. And I'm sewing really slowly to make sure that I am catching everything and that it looks consistently folded. I'll back stitch at the end. And this is my flat felled seam. This is really best for straight or as close to straight seams as you have. The flat felled seam is really commonly seen in the inseam of our jeans or trousers. So I would definitely check out any garment you have, any pair of jeans that you have. It's not on the outer seam, but it will be on the inner seam. It's a very sturdy, reinforced seam that is completely flat and flush to the body, so it really eliminates a lot of bulk. And it does not require a lining. So it's a great option if you want to create a garment with no lining, but still want beautiful finished seams. So that is the flat felled seam. And this would be the exterior of the garment, just to make note of that. My next seam sample is going to be the turn and stitched seam. So I have 2 pieces of 8" by 4" torn and blocked muslin again, and I'm going to line them up, and I'm going to sew them at a 1/2 inch with my right sides together. This is another option for a garment finish without using a lining. So I'm stitching and back stitching at the beginning and end. So I'm going to open up that seam again, and with the iron you will take the seam and press it open right on the stitch line, just like so. Then I'm going to fold my seam allowance to one side. I'm going to turn that seam allowance at 1/4 inch. So that the edge is touching that stitch line, and that's going to help me create a consistent fold. Finger pressing it. Finger pressing can even help you before you take it to the iron, just kind of put things in place. Okay, so just like that on one side. I'm going to go ahead, and while it's crisp and finger pressed, I'm going to go ahead and stitch it down. I am not stitching it to the base fabric though, so I'm going to move that out of the way, put my presser foot down, and I'm stitching right at the edge. So right at the edge of that fold. I'm going to open it up, and I'm going to do the exact same thing with the other side. So I'm folding that seam allowance so that the edge is touching that stitch line. Perfectly creased. I'm going to go ahead and again stitch down at the edge of this fold with my fabric out of the way. So when I'm finished, the exterior of my garment will be clean with the right sides facing. The inside will have this really neat seam. The seam allowance is loose. There are still the raw edges from wherever you cut your seam, but it'll be completely finished. This cannot unravel. Your fabric cannot fray past that stitch line. So technically it is a completely finished seam, even if it's slightly less finished than, say, the French seam. Your edges would get attached in whatever seam joinings or facings or hems, but this is another option for a garment that does not have a lining. Okay, now we are going to work on the 2 curved seam samples. So I have my 2 pieces together. I have a pencil here. I'm going to draw a really subtle curve. So something just like that will do. It's right in the middle of my piece. I'm going to go ahead and stitch on that line. So I'm positioning my fabric and my traced line so that it is directly in the path and under the way of the needle. I'm going to stitch and backstitch, and just like our seam sample, I'm going to constantly pivot and raise my presser foot with my needle inserted in the fabric as I stitch this line. So once that is done, I'm going to go ahead and trim my seam allowance on the outside of the line, so to the right of the line, at a 1/2 inch. I am just eyeballing it. If you want to go ahead and use your clear graph ruler to mark that seam allowance, that is totally fine, whatever your comfort level is. So I've trimmed my piece. It's a little thicker in some areas than others. So right now, if I were to open up this seam, and this is really my convex seam, it's going outward, some of it actually. A little bit of both. My seam allowance is not clipped or trimmed, and even though I'm pushing out my seam allowance to the stitch line, I'm getting a lot of points and a lot of flat edges, and that's because the seam allowance inside is really too voluminous, so you can see where it's rippling. It wants to collapse in on itself. So I'm going to push it back to the wrong sides out, and I'm going to begin clipping some triangles into the seam allowance. And this is going to allow that seam allowance to collapse on itself. So I've done a pretty fair job of clipping my seam allowance. Now I'm going to go ahead and fold my fabric over, and we'll be able to see a difference. You'll also notice if you need to take out any more by clipping, but now I have a much gentler and consistent curve. I really don't have too many peaks like I did before. And working that seam on the stitch line, I can take this to the iron and go ahead and use the nose of the iron to really press out that curve. But this is my convex curve. Okay, I'm going to move on now to the last seam sample that we're going to do. So we're going to do the same process, but sewing a concave curve. So here's my curve. I'm going to go ahead and stitch this line again. So I have stitched and backstitched at the beginning and end of my seam. Last time I determined my seam allowance is going to be on the outside of that curve. This time I'm going to cut my seam allowance at the inside. So I'm going to flip it over. Giving myself about a ½ inch. And then the same process, I'm going to begin clipping those triangles out of the seam allowance all the way around. So once it looks like this, I can go ahead and flip it so that the right sides are now going to be out, and really use your fingers to negotiate that seam allowance so that your fold is going to be right on your stitch line, like so. Until I need to take out a little bit more. And this is my convex seam. This one is probably most applicable for armholes in a garment or a neckline, right? It follows that traditional cutout that we need to fit a body part through. So after I would press this, it is completely finished, and those are the 4 seam samples for today.